Welcome. My name is Josiah McGee, and this video is a part of a series on the history of Christian Zionism and the U.S. Israel relationship. This series is a production of Passages, a nonprofit that is dedicated to preparing and empowering a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. Christian Zionism is often surrounded by many misconceptions, and it begs some important questions. What exactly is Christian Zionism? Where did it originate? Where did it come from? What motivates Christian Zionists? What role has it played in the U.S. Israel relationship? And today, perhaps the most pressing question, why is Israel such a divisive issue in American politics? This three-part video series attempts to answer those questions by providing the historical context that is often missing from the conversation. In order to give us that history lesson, we are very pleased and honored to be joined by Walter Russell Mead. Walter is one of America's foremost foreign policy thinkers, a renowned scholar, author, and writer for a weekly column at the Wall Street Journal. He holds a distinguished fellowship at the Hudson Institute, and he is also the Alexander Hamilton Professor for Strategy and Statecraft at the University of Florida's Hamilton Center. A Yale graduate, he's also held senior positions at the Council on Foreign Relations and taught at both Bard College and Yale. Finally, Walter is the author of several acclaimed books, including Special Providence, God and Gold, and The Ark of a Covenant. I know that you're going to enjoy very much hearing what Walter has to say and his many stories. This is part one of our series on the history of Christian Zionism and the U.S. Israel relationship. Many of the controversies about Christian Zionism are, if not directly, at the very least indirectly, a result of misconceptions or confusion about where it comes from in the first place. So in this initial conversation, Walter is going to tell us the origin story of Christian Zionism and tell us a little bit about the people who made it popular and what their motivations were. Let's get started.
I'm not sure you can. It's a label that people throw around in politics, but a lot of the labels that people use become so vague and so controversial that it's really hard to get a meaning. Words like liberal or conservative. You'll often find people use these words in so many different ways. Two people having a huge disagreement over what's the real conservative or the real liberal or the real progressive for that matter. And what's actually going on is they've each got different definitions of these words in their heads, and they're just kind of fighting about that without realizing what they're doing. Christian Zionism is one of these terms that sounds so definite but is so vague that people can't help but use it, but then almost always it leads to misunderstanding. So when you talk about, in a more general sense, Christians who support or are in some way sympathetic to the state of Israel or to the Jewish movement of Zionism, which is sort of the national movement of the Jewish people, you get all kinds of different reasons why Christians support it. Some of them do it out of a very, very specific theological framework. Dispensationalists do it out of a sense of God's covenant by which the promised land was given to the physical descendants of Abraham is still valid, and also at the end of the world or in the last days, some very specific events will be happening on a very specific timetable, and Jews in Israel in a state are part of that process. Others are come at it from a much more sort of vague, almost humanitarian sense. The Jews are a persecuted people. Anti-Semitism is a real thing. Jews need to have a state somewhere where they can be safe, and Israel is the place where it is. Some Christians support Israel less out of any theological or even humanitarian reason, but because they think Israeli interests and American interests in foreign policy in the Middle East are aligned. So people with all of these different points of view can get called Christian Zionists, but what have you said when you've called someone a Christian Zionist? So, you know, it's a term I try to stay away from, honestly, because I think it confuses rather than clarifies. There's a process, you know, England historically had actually been one of the most anti-Semitic countries in Europe. Many people are familiar with Merchant of Venice, a play by William Shakespeare, which has just about every anti-Semitic kind of, you know, Tucker Carlson could read The Merchant of Venice with great pleasure, and he probably has. And this was performed before the King of England to great applause. You go back even further, and the English kicked the Jews out of England even before the Spanish Inquisition kicked Jews out of modern Spain. So, you know, but England begins to change, and a lot of it has to do with the impact of the Reformation in England, where theologically people begin to take a different view of the Jewish people and their relationship to Christians and Christianity, and also in some ways kind of economic and cultural ideas change in ways that create a less unsympathetic approach to Jews and Judaism. Traditional Western Christianity, and for that matter Eastern Orthodoxy, held to the idea of, you call it supersessionism, which is that Israel in what Christians call the Old Testament, you know, was the promise, was the people of the promise, the people of the covenant. But with the sacrifice of Christ, the Old Testament was ended, and the role of Jews in God's plan also came to an end. From then on, the church was the new Israel, and the physical descendants of Abraham who rejected the message of Jesus kind of had no, you know, they were sort of leftovers, and they had no real purpose. There was kind of nothing there. Some people said, well, the fact that the Jews were exiled from Israel following their revolts against the Romans was God's punishment on Israel for rejecting Jesus. And so the Jews, by their exile and their poverty and their suffering, testified to the truth of Christianity. And that was kind of the place that Jews had in the Western imagination during much of the Middle Ages, late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Some of the Protestant reformers began to take a different tack, especially people kind of in the tradition of John Calvin, the Calvinist reformers. And for them, they said, well, look, the promises of God are eternal, and okay, the Jews may have been unfaithful in their theological view by rejecting the message of Jesus, but because the Jews abandon God doesn't mean that God abandons the Jews. And they can, of course, point to all kinds of examples in the Old Testament and in the New where God's faithfulness to sinful people is kind of the essence of God's relationship with humanity. And so for these folks, there's the idea that, yeah, the church is really the main action today. And that's where the heart of God's revelation is, the core truth, the salvation is all from the church, from Jesus, and not from the law of Moses. But Jews, the descendants of Abraham, still have a place in God's plan. And as they looked at various prophecies, both in the Old and the New Testament, about the end times, what they see is that the Jews do return at some point to the Promised Land. Jews are living in the Promised Land as God rings the curtain down on history and we move toward the Last Judgment. So They came to see Jews as having a continual place in God's purposes. The Jewish nation as a nation still existed, and there was still a role for the Jewish people in the history of in the sort of history of salvation. And that was, that really led to some different ideas. It led to a lessening of the prejudice that a lot of people had of Jews. In a sense, it turned Jews from being a sign that Christianity might not be true, which is the way people often thought in the Middle Ages, is like, well, wait a minute. If Jesus is really true and right, and the scriptures really testify to the truth of Jesus, the fact that all of these Jewish scholars of the Old Testament for hundreds of years have been studying the scriptures and they don't think he is the Messiah, well, that sort of cuts at the whole basis of who Jesus is, and it raises doubts. But then for the Calvinists and other Christians as time goes by, you get more the idea, no. God said to Abraham, the Jewish people will continue. And look, thousands of years later, they're still here. The ancient Egyptians are gone, the Assyrians are gone, the Babylonians are gone. All of these great empires of ancient times rose and fell, but this one people is still here, and God said in the Bible they would be here. And so the fact that we have Jews in the world today shows us that God is faithful and that the Bible is true. So as the Jewish people move from being a sign in the Christian imagination that Christianity is false to being actually a proof that people bring forward to show that Christianity is true, you get a different kind of an attitude. Oh no, dispensationalism comes very late in this process. We're talking about this new look at the Jews and this new thinking about maybe, it's a good, maybe the Jews are going to go back to the promised land at some point, and maybe that's a good thing. That begins to happen in the 1500s. Dispensationalism doesn't come along till sometime in the 1800s, almost 300 years after this new development. And it was always, it has always been a minority perspective among Americans, even among American theologically conservative Protestants who are generally speaking pro-Israel. Dispensationalism has always, and certainly remains today, a minority view. Again, in the medieval world, Christian teaching was pretty hostile to anything that we would call banking. Interest was something that supposedly good Christians weren't supposed to charge. The laws of economics weren't known, and to the extent that they were known, they weren't liked. And anything having to do with banking and finance smelled suspicious to people. And Jews, in part because in much of Europe they were forbidden to own land or make a living in normal ways, were actually traders and bankers, and often involved in making loans to kings and so on. And so the Jew was seen as this usurious, evil figure because the economics, ultimately capitalism, was seen with great suspicion. And as Anglo-American society in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the 17 and 1800s, begins to incorporate a lot more of the capitalist spirit. And in fact, the Anglo-Americans become very successful bankers and financiers, and capitalism enters the culture of the English-speaking world in this new way. Well, it didn't bother quite as many people quite as much that Jews had some sort of historic relationship with banking and capitalism. I think you could see Christian support for the idea of a Jewish return to the lands of the Bible basically comes to America with the Mayflower, in the sense that the Puritans in New England who came here and established the colonies in New England were people who came out of an emerging theological tradition in England, Puritanism, England and Scotland, where the idea that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land was an important part of future history, prophesied in the Bible, and something that Christians should be supportive of and hopeful for. That was already kind of embedded in their culture and their theology. Now, in theological terms, this would amount to, getting rid of the impact of original sin, curing original sin and the misery, pain, and death and suffering that it brought into the world through human intellectual action without any particular divine intervention. And people began to think that progress, the progress they were seeing around them, was going to solve all the problems of the world. And so for Americans, they saw themselves in a really special place in this Enlightenment. The American vision of history, very common American vision of history in the 17 and 1800s, was that you had first the birth of Christianity back in the ancient world and great ancient civilizations, but the church was corrupted. The barbarians came. There was a second fall into the darkness of the Middle Ages. But then first, the Renaissance rediscovers the learning of the old world. The Reformation rediscovers the religious truths of the original gospel as preached by Jesus and the apostles. And with that, we come back to the old spirit of liberty. We know ancient Athens was a democracy. Ancient Rome had a free government of its own before the republic collapsed into empire. We were rebuilding with the true gospel. We rebuilt virtue. We were now recovering the principles of free government, and we were going to advance beyond that into this new era of unparalleled prosperity, resting on the liberty and true religion that the Americans represented. And Americans really saw their history in this way, whether they were religious or not, by the way. This notion of America as the kind of spear tip of global progress toward a higher, better world was deeply, deeply installed into American culture. Why do I say was? It still is today. These ideas are still very much at the core of the way a lot of Americans think about our country, its history, and our future. Well, now, American Christians and non-religious Americans, many non-religious Americans, came to this vision of history and progress. And what they thought was, okay, now it's our job to spread this vision. Okay? And they went, when Americans traveled overseas, they went to Italy, they went to Greece. Beginning in about the 1830s and 40s, they actually started going to, the Holy Land. And what they saw shocked them in all of these cases. Americans in those days, believe it or not, educated Americans had something that you may have heard of, but perhaps few of you have had, a classical education. That is, they grew up reading the ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Roman texts, not always in the original, of course. But you read ancient Greek poetry and you hear about how rich and how beautiful Greece is. Oh my goodness, the land is so beautiful, so generous. Same thing, Italy, how noble the people are, how beautiful the land are. You went to these places in the middle of the 19th century, and what you saw was kind of shocking. Rome was a malarial hellhole in the summer. The government was crooked. The peasants were poor and oppressed. There was no sense of freedom. You go to Greece, and it was just struggling to get out from under the Turkish occupation. The Holy Land was basically a desert. When Mark Twain went there, he said, well, it's almost as bad as Arizona. And yet you read the Bible, it's a land of milk and honey, and then you look at like barren stones. For a lot of Americans, it was natural to think that if the peoples of those lands, if the Italians, the Greeks, and the Jews could recover the ancient virtues of their ancestors, then those lands would bloom again. And Americans actually went to Greece to help the Greeks fight the Ottoman Empire to regain independence. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, her husband was actually a decorated hero of the Greek Revolution, an American who'd gone over there to help fight. And the Garibaldi was a huge hero in America, the big Italian unification hero. Actually, there was a movement to name him a general for the Union side in the American Civil War. And the Americans also thought that if the Jews went back to the Holy Land and they started practicing democracy and farming the land, which at the time, of course, most Americans were farmers, virtuous farmers, living under free government, and their land was blooming, the same thing would happen, and that the deserts of Palestine would bloom anew. So actually, Americans in the 1900s didn't just try to help the Italians and the Greeks. They actually tried to persuade Jews to go back to the Holy Land or to start farming. If you go to Jerusalem today, there's a place there called the American Colony Hotel. And it goes back to the attempts of Americans to buy land and persuade Jews living in Jerusalem to start farming this land, to begin the regeneration of the Jewish people and the Holy Land. Not only did American Jews have nothing to do with the creation of these ideas in the minds of many Americans, most American and indeed Western Jews totally resisted the idea. In the 1890s, an American preacher, William Blackstone, decided that in order to encourage the creation of a Jewish state or support the return of Jews to the Holy Land, he would get up a petition to the President of the United States asking that the U.S. use its influence with the European powers to get the European powers to pressure the Ottoman Turks to allow the Jews to return to the Holy Land. This petition almost immediately got signed by a lot of the leading American business and intellectual figures of the day. John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, these titans of industry, the editors of leading newspapers, the leading clergymen in the churches of the great cities of the American Northeast and Middle West signed this petition. American Jews, though, didn't want to sign. For many Western Jews, Jews living in Germany, France, England, the United States, in the 19th century, saw this history of progress in kind of a different way. Beginning in some ways with the French Revolution, Western countries started to offer their Jewish inhabitants a deal. That if the Jews would give up the idea that they were a separate nation, right, that they were an ethnic group, a proto-nation, and say, no, we're just a religious group. But I'm not a Jew who lives in France. I am a Frenchman with a Jewish religious background, right? Then France and later other countries would offer Jews legal and civil equality. In the past, Jews weren't allowed to sit on juries, weren't allowed to vote in many places. limits on property holding, all kinds of special restrictions and laws. And so the deal was, you give up Jewish identity as anything except a kind of private cultural marker, and we will accept you into Western society. And that opening led to what many call the emancipation of the Jews across a lot of Europe in the 19th century. But the key to this was, again, the abandonment of any idea of a Jewish nation that might one day return to its national home and set up a sovereign state. You had to drop that idea if you wanted to be a Frenchman, if you wanted to be an Englishman, if you wanted to be an American. And a lot of Jews bought into that. And in fact, many still do. Not every Jew is a Zionist. And this is one of the interesting things. Many Western Jews see themselves as citizens first and foremost of their own country, of the country where they were born or where they've immigrated, and don't see Israel as their country in a special way. Most American Jews in the 19th century had that view. And in fact, what was the largest denomination among American Jews, the Reformed Jews, actually specifically in their founding documents renounced the idea of a return to Jerusalem or a return to the Promised Land. And you can still see, by the way, today in America, by and large, if a house of worship for Jews is called a temple, right, that implies that the people who built it didn't think that there was a temple back in Jerusalem that they were thinking about or wanted to go to. It meant that that America was their promised land. This is where they wanted to live. And so many Western Jews saw the concept of Zionism or return to the Holy Land as threatening the basis of their integration into Western society, their emancipation, and everything they hoped and dreamed. So American Jews, by and large, were pretty anti-Zionist, and especially liberal American Jews. The New York Times was a pro-Zionist newspaper when it was owned by Christians, and I think it was late in the 19th century, it might have been early in the 20th, it was bought by a Jewish family and became anti-Zionist. So the history of this movement is really a very complicated, the rise of Zionism among Jews is a very different thing from the rise of support for a Jewish return to the Holy Land among Christians and non-Jewish Americans more generally. There was one guy in particular who's interesting to look at, had a real impact on the history of Zionism, even among Jews, and that was William Heckler. He was of mixed German-English parentage, but was a clergyman in the Church of England. And he was a strong supporter intellectually of the idea that biblical prophecy said that the Jews would return to the Promised Land, and this would be part of the great fulfillment of human history. And he was living in Vienna at the time, and he came across this odd pamphlet written by an Austrian Jew named Theodor Herzl. And he read it and he was stunned, because here finally was a Jew who was saying all these things that the Christians said, sooner or later the Jews are going to do this, to which their opponents among Christians said, oh, you're an idiot. There's no sign of a Zionist movement among Jews. What kind of a fool are you? The Bible does, that's just horse crap. The Bible just doesn't know what it's talking about. You are delusional. And so here's a Jew who now wants to form a movement of Jews to go back to the Holy Land. Heckler went off to meet Herzl, and they met, and poor Herzl had published this pamphlet, believing that, he had come to believe that a tide of anti-Semitism was rising. And if the Jews did not get out of Europe, they were actually going to be murdered en masse. That was the haunting fear of Theodor Herzl. But he publishes this pamphlet, and the Jews basically, almost without exception, all of his Jewish friends, all of his well-educated friends, all of the Jewish newspapers and everything, wanted nothing to do with this. He was actually a famous journalist. His own newspaper refused to use the word Zionist until writing his obituary. Okay? And now here was this crazy American, Anglo-German cleric who talks about, oh, these ideas are so great, I've been thinking the same thing. Heckler takes Herzl up to his own apartment where he's got maps of the Holy Land on the floor. He sings him a few songs that Heckler has written, hymns, shows him where he thinks the Jews should build their capital. I mean, it's all crazy talk from Herzl's point of view. Herzl's a totally secular Jew, didn't have his kids circumcised. Once the rabbi of Vienna, chief rabbi of Vienna, came to see him and knocked on the door. It's a very embarrassing moment because Herzl and his wife are decorating their Christmas tree. All right, so we are not talking deeply religious Jews here. And so now Heckler is talking about prophecy, Bible, all of this stuff, and Herzl is thinking, what am I doing? I wrote this pamphlet, and the only person who's interested is a madman. But then Heckler says something very interesting. He says, I know who would be interested in this. The Grand Duke of Baden. Heckler had been tutor to the son of the Grand Duke of Baden. The Grand Duke of Baden was also the great uncle of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Well, this electrified Herzl. He might actually be able to get his idea into elite German circles. And I mean, it's a very long story, complicated, fascinating story, by the way. But in the end, through Heckler, actually Herzl does meet the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And Wilhelm thinks, oh, that would be a great idea. Partly because it would get all these communist and socialist Jews out of Germany. Wilhelm II was an anti-Semite, no doubt about it. His son would join the Nazi Party, and Wilhelm never said a word against Hitler. But in any case, he thought this would be a great idea for all kind of German foreign policy reasons and so on. And he actually proposes to the Ottoman Sultan that the Ottoman Sultan give a province to be used in Palestine for the settlement of Jewish refugees. Ottoman Sultan wanted nothing to do with the idea. It died, but Herzl meets the Kaiser twice, actually once in Jerusalem, as well as meeting him in Germany and on the coastland of what is now Israel. In the late 1890s, anti-Semitism is rising everywhere in Europe, and all kinds of Jews are trying to think, as we sort of see now, where you have many Jews looking at this crazy rise of anti-Semitism on the left, on the right, among all kinds of different people, and saying what should we do? Why is this happening? What does it mean? How do we stop it? How do we keep our kids safe? What do we do? People are constantly doing, well, here's Herzl. He writes his pamphlet about what to do about the Jewish question, and suddenly the Emperor of Germany is talking to the Ottoman Sultan about creating a Jewish state. This makes Herzl a star, solidifies his position as the leader of the Zionist movement, and was an indispensable step in the sort of progress of the Zionist idea among Jews. So a Christian Zionist, if we want to use that term, like William Heckler, actually plays a massive role, massive historical role in enabling the victory of Zionism among Jews.
Let's pause here. Thank you very much, Walter, for this fantastic overview so far. In the next video, we will fast forward a little bit, go to the 20th century and talk about the founding of the State of Israel and the early history of the U.S. Israel relationship. See you then.